Welcome to Brave. Be inspired by the best leaders of Southeast Asia tech. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. I'm Jeremy Au, a VC, founder, and father. Join us for transcripts, analysis, and community at www.jeremyau.com. Hi, Prantik. I'm excited to have you on the show. It's amazing to see someone who has not only been a successful founder in the marketing tech space, but also someone who is a serial angel investor in Singapore's entrepreneurship scene, as well as an LP in various VC funds. And so I can't wait to hear your story and your insights, Prantik.
Thanks a lot, Jeremy. It's absolute pleasure to be on your show. I've been a big fan. I've heard quite a few episodes. So thank you for having me here. Looking forward to our conversation.
So Prantik, tell us who you are.
Yes, so I'm Prantik Mazumdar, the managing director of the CXM group within the Dentsu Singapore office. So I look after 3 brands which fall under the customer experience management group, including Happy Marketer, which is the company I co-founded, and eventually we had an exit with Dentsu. So it's an interesting phase where I'm looking after 3 brands, including the little baby that I'd kind of been part of for about a decade. Outside of that, as you rightly said, the last couple of years, I've had a good opportunity to kind of look at the Singapore or the Southeast Asia startup ecosystem. So I have had a good opportunity to invest either as an angel investor in some of these startups in the region, or help them as advisors in various cases. And as you rightly said, in 3 of the VC firms I have come in as a limited partner. So that's a bit about me professionally. On the personal side, I have a 5-year-old son. My wife is a doctor at NUH.
Amazing. How did the entrepreneurship bug first bite you?
I think the very first time it kind of bite me, or kind of I got introduced to it, was probably 2003 when I was in NUS. So it's been 20 years for me in Singapore, and I had come to pursue computer engineering, a bachelor's degree in the School of Computing. And whilst doing that, we got to hear that NUS was kickstarting an initiative called a minor in technopreneurship. So the word was a mouthful. It had tech and entrepreneurship. We had no clue what it was all about. So we just blindly signed up, sounded cool as a young kid. And I think that was an eye-opener because it was a 6-module course taught by some fantastic professors from Singapore and from overseas. For the first time, it gave us techies an idea of how do you build a product? How do you scale a product? How do you manage finances? Something I even didn't have any theoretical knowledge about. So I would say that's the very first time I got a sense of what does entrepreneurship really mean, and probably a peek into the Singapore ecosystem and how the different members of the ecosystem operate. So probably 2003, nearly 18 years ago.
So in what forms did entrepreneurship happen for you?
So yeah, I think when that exposure happened, I think clearly there was an interest and a curiosity to explore that path. I did want to take up the NUS Overseas College program to take that one notch higher. Unfortunately, unlike my eventual co-founder, Rachit, I didn't make it to NOC, but I kind of stayed close to that group. I kind of started vicariously living that journey through them. But then I think the big trigger point happened when I started my career at what was then called IE Singapore, International Enterprise Singapore, part of the Ministry of Trade and Industry. And I was deployed in the ICT industry group. And it had 2 genres back then. One was to help large telecom tech companies like ST Electronics, ST Engineering, Singtel. And the fascinating part was I was also given the responsibility to drive an initiative for internationalizing startups. So there was a Born Global Startup Initiative, a collaboration between IDA, IE Singapore, to kind of as part of Intelligent Island 2015 back then, the government initiative. And I think that was a game changer because, of course, I was part of the government machinery, but I got a very good breadth perspective of what are the different kind of startups in Singapore, what are their challenges, what markets are they looking. So I think that's the first time I kind of got a sense that hopefully one fine day I get a chance to give this a shot. So, but I spent 3.5 years there. I did not directly jump into kind of starting something on my own, but I did leave IE Singapore to join eventually 2 SMEs, a Singapore-based brand consulting firm called Strategy.com, which sent me back home to India to help, as a country manager, help expand. that probably was when rubber hit the road, because that's the first time I was in a private sector, small, medium entity, and I had to sell. It was a big struggle. I eventually came back to Singapore heading sales for an Indian digital marketing company called Pinstorm. That was fascinating because I got to sell by day and deliver by night, very entrepreneurial or intrapreneurial. And eventually, I think the entrepreneurial opportunity happened to me when my good friend and the original founder of Happy Marketer, Rachit, who's also from NUS, he reached out and said, look, you're doing this for someone else. Why not get together and do something together? So my official entrepreneurial journey began on 1st November 2011 when I came in as a co-founder and managing partner at Happy Marketer.
What was that like being a founder, at least of two things at once, but also your first time of being a founder at the same time?
It was quite scary, to be honest. It kind of gave a sense of freedom because obviously there were no more office cards, there were no office laptops, etc. At the same time, so to be honest, it took me a good 6 months between my Pinstorm role to kind of convince myself, my family, to kind of just rationalize why am I doing this and what am I looking to achieve. And once I jumped board, I think it was exciting and but rather quite nervous. And I had this itch to want to prove to myself that, look, I can make this happen. Because I knew it's not just me. It's obviously there's a main founder, Rachit, and I obviously, he's a good friend and he's invested so much time and effort to kind of germinate this. So there was a sense of responsibility, yet a very interesting, nervous energy that, okay, I got to do something. I got to do something for myself, my family, as well as for Rachit, my friend and co-founder. But very, very exciting times. I think timing wise, Singapore, this is the time some of the global VCs were coming in, the startup ecosystem. We had just heard of one or two exits. So Darius from NUS had, and a bunch of other friends had exited their first startup. So it was just about beginning to shape up. Jungle Ventures, we had a few friends there. They were beginning to set up as well. Of course, there were other VCs setting up shop. There were lots of government one for one. The NRF initiatives began coming in. So there was a bit of noise to kind of give you confidence that, hey, this is not completely ludicrous. This is worthwhile exploring, but a very, very good feeling indeed.
What did you learn from being a founder at that time? What was your first 90 days, your first year like being a founder personally?
Yeah, the first 90 days, I remember that vividly. I think two or three things that come to mind. I think the three things that come to mind the first 90 days is A, how do I ensure that I kind of seal my place in the entity and make a mark, both in terms of my own confidence as well as to kind of gain some respect. So I think I had set a target that I am going to help the business grow from X to Y in that 3 to 6 month period. And I'm glad, business started coming in. I'd of course had some experience with my previous company in a similar domain, so that helped. But that gave a lot of confidence that I could make the rain happen. I could bring in some food on the table. That was exhilarating. The second is, of course, I think a sensation or a realization that it is not just about sales. It's also about how do you kind of deliver and how do you win a client's trust and love? How do you deliver so that they keep coming back? So repeat sales and good NPS scores, I think, was the second thing on my mind. And the third thing, which has, I think, stayed all the way through, is making payroll. I think it's very humbling that it's not just about you and your own rice bowl. It is eventually we had 60 people, in the early days, maybe 6 or 9 people, but they're counting on you or the leadership. So I think those are three things that I've stayed true to myself, that it's about business development, growing the brand, building that trust so that you can create a systematic, repeatable, predictable sales model where business starts flowing in either through direct or through partners. Second is, how do you ensure there is decent delivery? Because again, that adds up to the brand that you're trying to build. Having come from the world of brand marketing, I was always cognizant that that's the way to go. You want to build a true, genuine, reputable brand inside and outside the organization that's sustainable, that creates a decent flywheel. And I think the most important part of my journey, to be honest, Jeremy, has been about the people. We were a services business, not a VC investable. How do we stay profitable? How do we treat our people well to create a culture that's fun and interesting to kind of innovate together? But at the end of the day, it's about seeing those people do well in their careers, whether within Happy Marketer or many of them have gone on to join Facebook, Google, Flipkart, so on and so forth. Some have joined VCs. It's just good to see people that you work with flourish in life. I think that sentiment is quite dear to my heart.
As a Happy Marketer obviously grew over time in hindsight. Yet I also know that there were some tough times from previous conversations. So what were the tough times associated with that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a decade-long journey, a lot of tough times. I think, again, two or three that keep flashing into my memory. I think one is managing co-founders. And I think in our 10-year journey, we've had a couple of instances where, along with Rachit and me, there was another co-founder. Eventually, he decided to move on. So managing those conflicts or transitions head on, I think in our Asian culture, it's not really, you're not really prepared for it, to be honest. Dealing with conflicts, I think we always want to save face and try to kind of manage those in a diplomatic manner, but sometimes you can't. So I think those hard conversations, co-founder conversations, I think that's one. Very hard, but there's no two ways about it than dealing it head on, having hard conversations, sometimes getting in third party people to kind of arbitrate in a more peaceful manner. So I think that's one. The second is cash flow. Like I said, we had no funding, so it was all about profit first and managing cash flow. So I think the other scary moment in our business midway was there was a large education client which eventually did very well for us. But the challenge is it kind of became nearly 40% of our revenue. And I don't think we adept at managing risk well. So we were very happy. The account was growing, money was flowing in. But one fine day after 5 years, the client decided to move on. And I still remember July 5th, 2015. And that was a shocker because I obviously heard the news from the client at a coffee shop. I had to come and break the news. It obviously sank a lot of hearts. But I think, again, it's the beauty, just the way we're going through the pandemic. I think such crisis moments, it shows who are your real loyal supporters and how they kind of galvanize and come together. And I think, again, good lesson. It got us together. And thereafter, we've never allowed any one account or client to kind of go more than 20%. So I think cash flow and managing risk was the second lesson. And the third, well, tough time was, again, I think related to cash is non-payments. We've had quite a few unfortunate cases where, again, mostly in the early days where clients did not pay or did not pay on time. And heartbreaking because the work is done, you trust the system. Even in Singapore, of course, the law of the land is so good and it's enforced so well. But again, you realize, in many cases as a service provider, you're unable to bring the client, you're unable to take legal action. And I think I still remember there was a day sometime in the month of August in 2013 when I think we only had about $200, $250 in our bank account. We wake up to a OCBC SMS in the morning. That was rather scary. But again, I think it's those lessons which it's hard to learn in the bookish way, but it's those lessons that kind of make you realize that business is so much about scaling a business is so much about more than just selling. I came from a sales and marketing world, and I used to presume that if you sell, you close a contract, the job is done. But you realize that's when the job begins. And managing people, delivery, managing cash flow, managing risk, these have been interesting, tough lessons over the last decade.
Amazing. Lots of lessons there. Let's talk about co-founder conflict because that's such a common problem for so many founders. I mean, you probably have seen it, heard it from other folks as well. I guess the first question obviously say prevention is better than cure. So how would you go about or recommend thinking about how to prevent co-founder conflict with the experience that you have?
I think that's a good adage. In many cases, I think prevention is better than cure. And I think deliberate, I would just add the word deliberate in front of that, deliberate prevention. I think as we have matured, Rachit, myself, there are a few other colleagues who have today become partners. So I think the way we have managed it is, again, to put all cards on the table, not to hide anything in the kimono, under the kimono, just go all out. Be open about what are your expectations as a partner, what is the organization's expectation, and as much as possible, documented through an MOA or through a legal contract, even remuneration. To be honest, when we began, we just had a piece of non-legal paper between us founders saying, hey, here's the ACRA document, here's the shareholding, but that's about it. But as you matured, I think what I advise to all the companies that today, either if I'm involved as an investor or an advisor, is get that paperwork going. The good thing is in Singapore, the law of the land is it's sacrosanct. It's very well respected and enforced. So make the most of it. Put it out in the paper. One is the legality part of it. The other is even the non-legality part of it, which I think is critical. And I think that comes, again, just like personal relationship, it comes through conversation and over time. I've always believed that co-founders need to be conjoined with values, similar values, but skill sets need to be complementary. That's one. The second is, I think people have to be okay, just like in marriages, that people change, circumstances change. So every maybe 6 months to a year, we literally gather and we have a conversation saying, hey, are you guys still in this? Or your personal plans may have changed. Are you guys looking to move out? It's important because in a globalized world, there are so many options. People's desires, plans, circumstances can change. apart from the legalese, I think this is what's probably more important is if there is that healthy trust and open conversation to deliberately discuss this without fear of being kind of criticized or being judged. It's easier said than done for sure. But I think there is no two ways than going about this process in a deliberate manner and sometimes absolutely bring in external help. We've done this, we've gotten external bankers or external lawyers or corporate secretary folks to kind of just guide us because again, we don't know what we don't know. And none of us come from a legal background. So time and again, we kind of getting people to advise us on succession planning, on legal structuring, so on and so forth. I think I would sum it up at that. Legally document stuff, deliberately have a structured rhythm to talk about changes and in preferences, etc.
And let's just say,
and get in external help wherever needed.
And let's just say we do all this, we do all the prevention work, and things change. Company maybe is growing too fast, and not everybody in that founding team is growing fast enough. Employee-wise, if an employee is not growing fast enough, and the company is growing very fast, it's quite easy. You train up, you put a performance improvement plan, and maybe you shepherd the employee out in that scenario. But it's very difficult to do for a founder. So how would you articulate, if that's starting to happen, what advice do you have to how to handle that conversation and process?
Yeah, we went through that. I think, at one point, Dave, our third founder, he reached out and he said, look, I don't think I agree or I'm in alignment with the direction of the company or the growth path that the company has kind of decided on. Initially, it took a while. It was a bit of a shock, to be honest, because it was the first time. You kind of always envisaged and dreamed that just because you started something together, you'll see through the whole course, but that's not life. And I think once we acknowledged the difference, we kind of broke it down as to what is different. First, we tried that, hey, can we try and make amends or look at this differently? But once we realized that it's probably in everyone's best interest to kind of separate and move on, then came the harder part of how do you deal with equity? And I think that's something we've learned the harder way, that because we hadn't done a lot of things deliberately, we learned it the hard way that because there were no agreements in place, no exit clauses, etc. I think eventually as three friends, we said, hey, okay, you own X amount of equity. Now the question is, what's the value of this equity? We didn't have a third-party validation or no investments. That was very hard because obviously suddenly you're on two opposing camps. I would obviously, as the buyer, I would say, hey, the value is X. And, as the seller, I would say, hey, no, it's much more. So that's when we got in a third friend, a lawyer, and someone else from the industry who's a senior. We said, hey, look, if we keep debating ourselves, we'll not come to a conclusion because obviously we're on two sides of the camp. But let's get a third party, at least objective. And that helped. So we got an understanding that in the marketing or MarTech industry, what are the typical valuation models? We realized it's a multiple of EBITDA. And then we came to a near reasonable assumption. Now, the next problem was, okay, theoretically, we agree the value is X. Now, what about the payout, right? Again, we are a pure services business, month on month, based on profits. And that was, again, a hard challenge, but very thankful we finally came to an amicable agreement that we'll make it a 2-year payout on a monthly basis. We made it quite fair that if we miss payments, there will be an interest based on the market conditions, so on and so forth. And I think eventually, I would say the 3-month period was very hard, just like any separation. Because to be honest, as you rightly said, you could plan for this, but when it hits you, it's emotionally very hard because, you've built this together and suddenly one party wants to leave. But yeah, we had no choice to kind of deal with it as adults. And we put it into a contract, got it notarized. It was hard to actually pay out because that also meant it was detrimental to our growth or to our individual economics. But as entrepreneurs, you have to suck it up and do it. If you're playing the long-term game in a services business, we had a 25, 30-year horizon. We said, what, in the long run, maybe this 2-year will look like a blip. And I'm glad we managed to kind of get through that. We ensured the payment was taken care of within the 24-month period. I guess luck was also on our side because the business kept growing, which meant we had a little bit more cash to further reinvest in terms of growth. I think timing was good. But yeah, I think as they always say, hope for the best, but be prepared for the worst. It'll never pan out the way you want it to. As and when it happens, acknowledge first, take your time. But I think at the end of the day, I'm not too much of a conflict person, as I said earlier, right? Not grown up in that environment. So be thorough and be respectful and be gentlemanly about the way you go about it. I think it's important to have conflicts for sure, but I think in a healthy manner. Because again, life is long. You never know. Paths will cross. But I think the big thing I've learned in my 10, 12-year journey with Happy Marketer, Jeremy, is I think the value of external help, especially in areas that you don't know much about. And even if you think you know about, it just brings a good objective perspective. And I think when it came to finance and legal, I don't have a background in those subjects. Genuinely, it was very helpful to have friends from those industries come and advise us.
Wow, thanks for sharing. I love this very professional thinking around co-founder preparation and also breakups, because I remember someone telling someone that's like, hey, the average first time a person stays with a company is like 2 years these days. And then you're expecting co-founders to say 7 to 10 years.
Yeah.
It's not a reasonable thing. It's just people change. And so departures happen. So it's really going to be how professional you are and how professional the other person is going to be. And if both people are professional, then it's a very straightforward conversation, even though it's a hard conversation like just talked about.
And sometimes it's deliberate. I recently came across someone who from PropertyGuru, and I think their case study is quite well known. I mean, it was amazing what Steve and Ian did when they themselves realized that we need a professional CEO, and eventually they got in a hurry. And it was amazing. It's never easy because I think they've documented as part of the INSEAD case study that it's hard to let go. But it's amazing what they have done. And today, as you know, in Southeast Asia, it's a great story of where Hari has taken it with the investors and with the upcoming exit. So I think it's also that sometimes a breakup can happen to you the way it happened to us, but sometimes you need to break up because maybe it's not the composition of the founding board is not the right one for future growth. So I think, yeah, and I'm glad today founders, hopefully the ones who are listening or people maybe who already have an idea about this, that this is just part and parcel of growing a business. Change is inevitable. The only choice you have is to embrace it.
Yeah, that's 100% right. And I agree with you so much. I think this is a great point. And so, kind of like starting to move the story a little bit further, one of the interesting things that you've done is that now that you've grown Happy Marketer, you've already reached that payout that you talked about with the acquisition, now that you're part of the team, broader team. One interesting thing is that you've really started doing two sets of activities, which is angel investing as well as being an LP in VC funds. So I guess I got to ask the question, why are you angel investing instead of, I guess you can't take a holiday during the pandemic here, but so many ways to deploy resources. And so why angel invest?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, first and foremost, I'm still part of the earnout. So there's another good 2.5 years to go. So that's my core role to help Happy Marketer and the CXM group within Dentsu to grow. It's a very interesting transformational time for Dentsu. But why angel investments? I think there are honestly two reasons. The trigger point was so our acquisition happened in Feb 2019, and I did take a little bit of break. Glad I did before the pandemic. And during those trips, I started reflecting and I said, okay, so what next? I mean, yes, obviously there's an earnout and I want to grow, but what are the other options out there? Because I've been kind of plugged into the Singapore startup ecosystem for now 20 years in different formats, there were two real whys for me. One was in the pursuit of figuring out what next. I said, you know what, I want to stay connected to the startup ecosystem. Obviously, I can't start up right now. So the next two options that came my way were either to invest directly or through syndicates or through LPs, or even to advise. So I think anything that gave me an opportunity to kind of stay plugged into the startup ecosystem, I suppose to vicariously live the life through the founders, I thought that was one. I mean, my core desire, to be honest, is to get a perspective of what's happening in Southeast Asia. I grew up in Indonesia, so Indonesia is close to heart. Obviously, it's a hot market right now. Vietnam has been interesting, and it's great to see how these economies are growing and how startups are playing a big role. So I think it gives me a good excuse on a weekly basis to connect with founders, investors, other ecosystem players, just to understand their perspective, so that hopefully, once my earnout is done, it paves a path or an option for me to figure out, hey, if I do want to, get back to the startup ecosystem, do I go in as a founder, co-founder, or as an accelerator, or as an investor? And I must say, I'm quite enjoying the angel investor and advisory journey. But so that's one of the whys. And the other is, it may sound altruistic, but the real reason is also to kind of give back. I've been very, very fortunate to kind of enjoy the fruits of the Singapore startup ecosystem, the way it's beautifully structured, planned. It's so easy to set up. I mean, for me as an immigrant, I think it's been extremely fair and meritocratic. And to me, I think I was telling this to another friend the other day, that it's so much about equitable opportunity. And I think in today's world, I'm glad people are talking about sustainability, diversity, equity. And I think the biggest thing I'm very fortunate about is equitable opportunity all through my life. I grew up in India, Indonesia, had a good education, came to NUS that accepted me, I got a grant, etc. And I think the common thread there is I just got an opportunity. So to me, I tell myself, because I know you're a seasoned investor, you probably know this better, but as an angel, obviously everyone advised and said, look, it's a very risky business. And chances are, obviously, it is. So I told myself, look, whatever little quantum that I'm willing to kind of invest or play with, yes, I have to be prepared that this may never come back. But there is maybe this is my way of kind of appeasing myself, or my fear is, hey, if it gave an entrepreneur a chance or some confidence, if it created some jobs, I honestly think that would give me a lot of satisfaction because I've been the beneficiary for a long while. So, in the pursuit of what next, and in the spirit of hopefully supporting the ecosystem that I've benefited from, that's the real reason. And hopefully, I mean, having said all of this, hopefully this does make me some money.
I totally agree with you. I think that's very similar to my journey as well as an angel investor. And it's interesting that we share one common angel investment, which is Poland, which is a B2B marketplace for tackling a lot of the goods that are just overproduced and can be redistributed across the region. And it's also interesting that we have not agreed on all the angel investments either as well. So we'll find out in time to come what our point of view is. I won't say who's right, who's wrong. I guess we'll both learn from this process. I don't think it's like a binary yes or no, but it's a shades of gray. That being said, what are you looking out for as an angel investor? And let's talk about that. I'd love to brainstorm with you and talk about that with you.
Yeah. So, I'm quite obviously new to the journey, about 2 years, and I come from an operating background. So I think, to be honest, when I started, it wasn't a very deliberate thought process. But now I think, as with most things in life, when I reverse engineer and if I try and draw out patterns, I think a few things have stood out. I think because I've run a B2B business, I think I'm a bit more biased towards B2B startups. Just not that B2C doesn't have potential, it's just my comfort level. I think from a region focused, I guess, self-selection bias, most of the deals have been Singapore, ASEAN, to some extent India, wherever my networks are. So those are two ways I look at. Industry, again, I do look at the region and, at a macro level, which industries are being invested in or there is a lot of growth in. So I think the usual suspects of fintech and insurtech, by the time I started, there are some that fall in that bucket. There are also some that I think, again, are close to heart. So I think education, again, in the theme of equitable opportunity, I think edtech in different forms, especially the B2B side, has been of interest. And my wife's a doctor, so I think health or health tech, not the pharma side, but again, diagnostics or remote health, I think that's been an interesting area. So these are probably the common elements. But of course, over time, I did start getting a taste of, again, Singapore with its 2030 plan of sustainability. So I've looked at a few that are in the alternate protein or sustainability space as well. I mean, Poland is a good example of how they're trying to kind of reduce waste, I suppose, through the liquidation process. So yeah, I think those are at a macro level. The next set of criteria that I kind of deliberate about is there's a lot of talk rightfully about product market fit, but I think slightly before that, I look at two other factors. One is just the market size or the size of the problem. Is it a large enough problem? Are we going to see, or are we already seeing unicorns? Again, not for the sake of getting the tag of a unicorn, but is it a large problem set? I think that's one. The other is founder problem fit. I could be a good founder, but am I good for this particular problem set? And if it's large enough, I find that very interesting. Again, it's hard to predict, but over 3 or 4 meals or conversation, you kind of try and get how passionate and what's the depth or academic knowledge a person may have about the category, not just about his or her startup idea. So that matters a lot to me because, again, by the time I come in, usually being post revenue, obviously not post profit, but if it's post revenue, I would want to get a sense of, and not the founder, but the founding team, how well entrenched are they into that subject. The next few things I look at is, of course, since I do post revenue, it's more than the revenue quantum, it's the repeat business. Even if someone has 2 clients, having seen that as an operator, it's a great satisfaction and tells a lot about the company and the product if a customer comes back again and again. So a couple of insurtech companies, the 2 examples. One had 10 clients, but maybe only one of them came back. The other one had 3 clients, but all repeat business. So that gave me good confidence on the latter. So that was an interesting factor I look at. Also, because I've come from a services people background, I like to look at the team and obviously founding team, both in terms of chemistry and equity structure, because like we spoke about, there have been cases where one founder has 90% and that's it. And whilst that's fine, if that's the agreement, but to me, I think there has to be some sort of de-risking, I suppose, for the other founders to have a bit more of an incentive. Also, of late, I'm seeing startups where it may be early, but at least they are deliberating that, look, I must keep 10 to 15% for ESOP. So some of that thought process, I think does guide my thinking process, because it's still very early in the game when I come in. So you never know how it's going to happen, in terms of product market fit and scaling up. But I think some of these criteria in terms of market size, geography, industry, team structure, founder problem fit, ESOP structure, quality of revenue. I think these are some that I've kind of late, I do deliberate a lot about. Of course, I would do some reference checks. Of course, if it comes through, if it's a co-investing opportunity with with an investor like you, for example, that helps. That gives some sort of a comfort level as well. But yeah, those are some thesis or some parameters that I would try and make some judgment calls on.
What's interesting is that both you and I are founders who are now on the angel investor side, so kind of like crossing to the other side of the table. And so you're looking at all these founders go by, and they're not only founders, but you see a little bit of yourself in them as well. So what's it like looking at all these founders? What advice would you give them? Because you've seen both sides, what advice would you tell them? Because they're looking at to go out and raise their first angel round or checks.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So, as a founder, first thing I tell myself is, look, now I'm on the other side. So I can't behave like a founder. Yes, I can share my perspective, but I'm not driving the show. I got to be very respectful of that. I got to be comfortable in that skin. The next is, the two or three things that I do tell the portfolio companies when I catch up with them is, I think one is, especially the product business, I think it's important to kind of, obviously, you got to love the problem and the solution that you're building. But I think needs to be some element of being nimble and flexibility to pivot. And again, not pivot because it's a cool term, but it's about to get to that product market fit. Again, you may have started off with idea A, but maybe idea A is not the best way to get to that commercial viability. So that flexibility on being coachable or just being open to ideas to explore models, I think to me that's important. Second thing is competition. It's one of those hey, who's competition? Many of them will say, hey, by the way, no, we have no competition. And that's a red flag for me. Because it may be true that there's no direct competition, but I think there could be, in most cases, there is indirect competition. Maybe the customers are solving the problem in a completely different way. So I think very, very important to kind of be near paranoid. If not paranoid, just be curious about, who else could attack me, if there isn't an existing competition already. The third is, I think, especially if it's in a scaling up stage, I think what I kind of tell them is the importance of creating processes and systems. Because we learned this the hard way, even in a service business, is if it's dependent on a founder, a individual, that's a lot of risk. There's a key man risk, etc. But as a business, if you have to scale, I think you've got to figure out systems, processes, and teams that can help you generate predictable, scalable, repeatable revenue without the hero, whoever the founder is. And that's important. So, I'm a big fan of Vern Hamish's book, Scale Up. And I learned a lot about how do you kind of build those tools and processes and teams to kind of do that. And the same goes on the delivery side. I think in the region, I think especially product startups, I've been telling them that, hey, look, you also got to be vigilant and focused about variables in your control. You can't control all variables, but if you're building a product, hey, are you optimizing for UI, UX? Or what about the core product? Are you hiring, recruiting good quality data science and engineers? I find this even in many of my portfolio companies that many of them are probably not, they could do much better to invest in the product teams, engineers upfront, or whenever they have access to funding. So I think that's something I would love to see more of, because again, a few of my friends who happen to be, let's say, whether in China, India, or in the Valley, where things have scaled up so much, I think the focus on good engineering is massive. So I think that's another. And the last is, really about if you're, and again, and I got to be careful there because I've never run a VC investable business, but from an objective lens, I think, if you're playing that VC game, someone also has to be driving the whole raising process. And you obviously know this much better than me. We are in a market where there's a lot of cash. Money is chasing. The tigers of the world have changed the model, going in early. So who's going to drive that process? Who do you pick up money from? Because again, as I was telling you when I was having a conversation with some of the other VCs like Eping, etc., kind of the signal is that the founders have a lot of choice. So if that's indeed the case, I think it's very important for founders to kind of be strong from a perspective of just being rational about who do you want to raise from and why, who are the other people you're talking about. So someone has to be deliberate about that process and be very, very good at negotiating those terms. Something that's fair, yet it kind of helps the business. So yeah, as a founder, I think some of my conversations with the other founders are, yes, initially you're the only one or maybe one of the four important people, but you've got to plug yourself outside of the business or on the business. You can, after a while, you need to get to a stage where you're on the business and not in the business, so that you can look at these different jigsaw puzzles together. That's the fun, that's the challenge. You've got to be raising, you've got to be racing for growth. You also may need to be able to remove competition. So yeah, my conversations are usually around these, yeah, when I have a time to chat with these founders.
And what's interesting is that you've also done the mezzanine investing as different companies, especially across the US, Europe, and you also now become an LP in VC funds. So talk us through what's it like to be an LP at a VC fund? Because I think very few people get to do so. So how does it feel?
It does. It is a privilege. And I'll tell you my rationale for doing that. I suppose it's a bit of hedging because the early stage, the objective I told you are those two factors of staying rooted to the ecosystem and giving back. But of course, as I've learned, you've got to play the game for a bit of a longer time. Exits may come, if at all they come, 4, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. On the other side of the spectrum was when I came across some of these late stage mezzanine deals, be it Palantir, UiPath, Stripe, I realized these are relatively, like Palantir, I kind of got it maybe 6 months or 8 months before the IPO. So I think it did two things, to be honest. One is it provided relatively safer near-term liquidity if it did well. So Palantir was a good one for me. So that definitely helped. To be very honest, there's also a bit of conversation factor because it kind of opened doors. When I did that and people heard that or read that, it kind of became I suppose, a door opener or a conversation starter, which definitely helps. So I think the mezzanine pre-IPO did that. It also allowed me to kind of network with a different set of folks, the folks from the iBanking world, which, to be honest, during my happy marketer days, I really wasn't interacting with too many iBankers. So I started getting used to their terms, their buzzwords. In my industry, I'm used to CPC, CTR, but it was good to kind of hear their set of terms and their perspectives on the world. The VCs was, I suppose, somewhere in the middle ground. As an LP, it was very interesting. So I had a good opportunity to join James, Jeffrey, and Yiping at Quest, HealthX Capital, Anurag and Seemant and Amit, Good Protein through Jayesh Parekh, who's always been a good mentor as well. I think it did two things. I think it allowed me a chance to network with the other LPs, definitely helps the network. I kind of got a chance, a privy to the process, and which was very interesting. It has shaped my angel investment process as well, because what I had not understood or done well in the angel investing process is the commercial and contract negotiation. And I've learned when I see how the VCs do it, how you guys do it, there's a nice filtering process. You guys probably look at, I don't know, 1,000 deals and pick 20 or 50. So already the deals you're attracting because who you are is already high quality. B, there's a nice due diligence filtration process, which is needed and which is good. But I think what opened my eyes was the contractual commercial negotiation process. Like till I did some co-investments or till I saw the VC terms, I didn't ever think about liquidation preference, for example. I would only think of the entry, not the exit process. That was an eye opener. Also, the planning that when you're investing in company A, broadly, most VCs typically have an idea that, hey, if it grows this way, here's a potential exit. Maybe I'll talk to a bigger VC or here's a strategic that I can look at. So I think it's the post-entry, post-investment journey, the thought process. I think it was a big, big learning lesson for me. It wouldn't have happened otherwise. So quite privileged. So I think each of these three buckets bring different networks, different language, and different processes, which as a pure founder, I would have never had the opportunity to kind of learn from.
Amazing. So wrapping things up here, could you share with us a time that you were brave?
Well, two things come to mind, Jeremy. One is you've taken me back to NUS days. So as I was saying, I was been quite a privileged person when it came to education, opportunities, etc. And I've done well in my academic life all till the point I came to NUS. And it was in my year 3 that I failed for the first time in a module, let alone not doing well. I failed in an electronics module. It was embarrassing. And I think the brave part of it in hindsight was owning up and accepting that failure. Honestly, it took me a lot to accept that, hey, I've always, in Jakarta, I stood first in A levels in the whole city. And suddenly I'm here in a good university and suddenly I flunked a module. To open up to my friends, to my parents, it may not sound much, but at that point in time, I think it was massive. And to be honest, in our Asian or Singapore education system, I think what it did to me is it kind of told me that acknowledging and being open to failure and figuring out a way to come out It takes a lot. It makes you humble. It tells you that, look, you're not as good as you think you are. And it helps you find a process. Just the way Bill Gates says, you learn so much from a failure. That bravery to face up to society, especially in Asian context, that's something that comes to mind. From a work context is letting go of a client. Being a salesman, I've always, 99% of my time is to acquire clients. But I think there were two occasions where, for two different reasons, I had to let go of a client and to communicate that to a client, again, in a Singapore Asian context, that, hey, we don't want to do work with you. One was because of lack of payments. And the other one was because of the client was not treating our team very well. And I realized the importance of that. Again, it was a very hard decision because, as a salesperson, just not used to it. I'm there to say, hey, I'm here begging for your business. I'm here to win your business. But to kind of, again, goes back to separation and the divorcing process. It took a lot of humility, it took a lot of practice to kind of shape the narrative. Because, of course, you want to bow out, but you want to bow out respectfully. You don't want to burn bridges. But I think when it came to the cash, I could still understand, fine, I can find a way. But I think it took a huge toll on me, Rachit, and our teams were not being respected. And I think when you're running a services business, all you have is people, good people. And if it impacts your culture, we learned it the hard way. I'd read in a book that you've got to be employee first. But when I had to do that, at that very morning after my Starbucks coffee, when I had to enter that office, I'll still remember to kind of break the news. The client obviously was not expecting that. I haven't saved a life like my wife does on a daily basis. I haven't climbed the Himalayas. But to me, breaking up with a client which was paying very well, I thought took a decent amount of bravery.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. I can totally visualize both of those scenes, and especially breaking up a client is also very, very tough, to be honest, because you're like, yeah, you spend so much time fighting for this person and then managing this person and call it quits. I totally get it. So I'd love to wrap things up here. I'd love to kind of share the 3 big things that I learned from you from this conversation. The first, of course, is thank you so much for, I think, sharing what your founder path was. And I think you just actually shared a lot of knowledge actually of what I call the professional co-founder relationship, both from the preparation, the picking, the discussions, the negotiations, the relationship, and even the breakup. And I love that long-term view looking back, which is, at the end of the day, this is business in the sense that it is expected that people move on from any company. And it could be a co-founder moving on, it could be yourself moving on. It's really about how the conversation is handled. I think that's such great advice because it not only helps people who are thinking about breaking up, but I think it helps co-founders who are having tough times and even founders who are worried about having a co-founder because they're scared about having an eventual breakup. So really strong advice here. The second, of course, is thank you so much for sharing about what I call the angel and founder POV. So sharing what you think about why you angel invest personally and why that's relevant for other folks. But also the advice that you would give other founders now that they're pitching to you about how to be thoughtful about their approach, their team, and how they present. And honestly, I think the key word here is coachable. The last thing that I'd love to share is that you really have a strong point of view on what I call the moment of bravery, which is saying these are the tough moments that you face, like breaking up with a client, negotiating with co-founders. And I just love everything that you said, which is I think you contrast all the other people that you respect, the VCs that you feel have a great process, which to some extent you do, but not as much as you think, I would say.
Thanks for revealing the secret.
The secret. The other senior angels you mentioned, which also I think is also kind of weighing in from my perspective. And the other folks that you admire, like your wife, who save lives as well.
Yeah.
But I think I really love that humility and that frankness about how to get help and be brave. So thank you so much, Prantik, for coming on the show.
No, thank you, Jeremy. I think these conversations help one reflect. And also, I think I've learned so much. I mean, I'm a big fan of your podcast and I've read stuff that you guys write on your blog stuff. I think what you're doing is great to bring out, to allow people a platform, an opportunity to share their story, their bravery, their failures. But also, I think hopefully people who are listening, hopefully, like I was sharing with them, if it sparks an idea, if it helps someone on a just a normal day, I think that's it. I think that's the beauty of these platforms. And thank you for doing this through the Brave podcast.
Thank you so much, Prantik.
Thank you. Pleasure being here.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share this episode with friends and colleagues. Sign up at www.jeremyau.com to discuss this episode with other community members in our forum. Stay well and stay brave.